ahead.
All right, thanks, Nick. And thanks, folks. It's really great to hear all the cool stuff that's happening on the ground. And so what I'm going to do is go through, when I was in Santa Fe in June, I heard a lot of really great ideas, but I also heard some areas where I think we have information from social science and that can maybe help you think about how to do things a little bit differently or give you some insights into some of the challenges that you're frustrated with. So I'm going to go through things pretty quickly because there's actually a lot of information that might be of use to you. So the idea is to give you an idea what's out there. And then if you want more details, you can follow up on it. So there's these three main topics that I'm going to cover. And this is pulled, so there's been a lot of research since 2000 on social issues of fire programs, defensible space. Pam Wilson's involved in one particularly great study that's looking at it. But there's been all sorts of other studies across the country. And that information has been synthesized into various documents. And so a lot of what I'm talking about is pulled out of these two documents. And this is just thrown up there to make the point that these studies are not just in the western U.S. They're done throughout the country. Most of them are in fire-prone areas, although you see the star for Chicago. There was actually one where we actually surveyed people in Chicago. And the point is that the general patterns I'm talking about are actually pretty consistent across the country. When they don't fit, it tends to be because of a very specific local contextual dynamic that's going on. So I think the key thing is the message is beware the imagined public. There's a lot of stories and ways people talk about the public and they think here's what the public thinks and here's why they behave the way they do. And I think it's really important to be careful of that because the key takeaway from the social science research is that they don't support the conventional wisdoms about the public response to fire management. There's only one narrative I've heard about the public and their thinking that I think holds up. But all the rest basically don't get supported. So I'm going to quickly go through a couple of these. And I saw some indication, that there's a question, how do we get people to understand the risk? And that's kind of the thing. The reality is actually anybody who lives in a fire-prone area does. They understand that there's the fire risk. Yes, there will be the odd individual who doesn't get it, but the vast majority, 95% plus, understand they live in fire-prone areas. But risk is a really complicated and subjective concept. So oftentimes when we're talking about risk, we might be talking about completely different things. And so we're responding to different elements. So the classic definition of risk is probability of an event times the negative consequences that might occur. So if you're talking about different time frames or different spatial extents or different types of damage, you might actually come up with a different risk calculation. Another thing is that we often confound hazard versus risk. So like a good example is when we do those check-offs of homes of, how much vegetation they have and whether or not they have a roof and they come up with a number. That's a hazard assessment. That says, what are the conditions on this property that increase the chance it's going to have damage if there is a fire? But that is not a risk assessment because that doesn't take into account all the other factors that would shape the probability of the fire, what the severity of the fire is going to be. So you could have a house that would come out very high on the fire hazard assessment, but if it's on a barrier island off South Carolina where it's very wet and there's not a lot of emission sources, it actually does not have a high fire risk. So oftentimes we confound these things and people respond differently to these different types of topics. So one example of that is from focus groups that we did in these 5 locations, and we asked people, so on a scale of 1 to 10, what's the fire risk for this area? And so as you can see, if they ask about the fire risk for the area, it's pretty high. You can't say that they don't understand that there's a fire risk. But then we said, so what's the risk to your house? Okay, so they come out with a much lower number, and this actually is very rational. You're talking about a much smaller spatial extent, and you're talking about a very specific consequence. And then if people would also talk about, and they would recognize that when they explained their rating and why they gave the rating, they'd also say, it's also because I've done a lot of mitigation, which has lowered the risk that my house will be damaged. So oftentimes I think when we get frustrated because homeowners aren't doing anything, it's because, or they don't get the risk, it's because we might be talking about very different risks. And actually, if you calculate the risk of losing your house to a wildfire, based on the fact on average we lose 3,000 houses every year, and the number of houses that are in the WUI, to me, the bigger question is why anybody's doing anything, because the risk is like 0.0000001%. So I think that's the key is to recognize that risk is oftentimes we're talking about different things. And the other thing is how we respond to risk is very different and very personal. So in those focus groups, we had 3 in each location, one of people who lived in town, one of people who lived out in the woods in the intermix, and one of people who lived in the interface. What was really interesting is that it was consistent that people who lived in town gave higher area risk ratings than people who lived out in the woods, which seems counterintuitive because, well, they're not as exposed. When you read what people were saying, you saw 2 dynamics were going on. One is people who lived out in the woods were balancing the benefits, and this has been shown that the higher the perceived benefit of an exposure to a risk, you tend to see the risk is a little bit less because you're getting a quid pro quo for the benefit you get. You're going to put up with a bit more risk to get that benefit. And then the other thing that was going on that was more interesting to me was you had self-selection was going on. So people who were really risk averse were just saying, I'm not going to go live out there. That's just too scary for me. And so kind of when we talk about how we have to raise risk perception, you're probably not going to, A, the risk perception is high, and B, you're probably not going to change much because those people who live out there are already tolerant of the risk. They have decided that, yeah, I'm okay with this because I get all these other benefits and it doesn't scare me. And there's all sorts of reasons why it doesn't scare them. So what this sort of boils down to is that risk perception doesn't lead to action. It's not the integral thing. Yes, it is necessary. People do have to see there's a risk to decide to do something, but that's not going to be sufficient. Things that are going to shape it, whether you mitigate is the risk tolerance. Somebody who's risk averse may choose not to live out there. Somebody who's risk averse and lives in the interface or intermix may do everything on the book. And somebody who's risk averse may say, I'm not going to do anything because I just don't want to deal with it. So it can lead to all sorts of different ways we respond to it. The trade-offs with the benefits, and then individual capacity comes into it, whether or not you have the time, money, et cetera, et cetera. Another one is Smokey's taught the public to think all fire is bad. I think pretty much you guys all know that this isn't hold anymore. And there is really consistent evidence in studies that the public has a good understanding of fire ecology and that fire actually has a beneficial role in their ecosystem. They understand it's not if there's a fire, but when there's a fire. And what's kind of notable in these studies is how often the authors of an article will say, and it was actually a very sophisticated understanding of fire ecology. So people understand where they live. And the other demonstration is that it's very consistent in surveys asking about prescribed fire thinning that 80% see prescribed fire as an appropriate management tool, which shows that they can distinguish between different types of fire. And that's roughly 30% give strong approval, 50% give qualified, and I'll touch on the difference between what shapes the difference between those. And there's a very clear preference for active management. So when you ask people to rate their preferences for prescribed fire thinning and doing nothing routinely comes out as the least preferred option. This is probably the one I hear most often right now, which is people don't take responsibility. How do we get people to take responsibility? And this really kind of drives me bonkers because in my experience, what's really going on in that conversation is it's a displacement of responsibility. So agency people talk about how do we get homeowners to take responsibility. We're doing our part, they're not doing theirs. Whereas homeowners, when I talk to homeowners, they're saying, well, we're doing our part, but the agencies aren't responsible for their land. So there's a very interesting dynamic of sort of everybody focusing responsibility on somebody else isn't taking part. And I think it would be much better to have the conversation around shared responsibility and what I'm doing to fulfill my part and how can we help you fulfill your part, but rather than this idea that people aren't taking responsibility. Because in the studies, it's very clear that people say, no, I chose to live out here. This is my property. It's my responsibility to reduce risk on my property. But they do recognize the risk is shared. They know the risk is it's an interdependent risk, and so they are concerned about actions on adjacent properties. And that can make them both more proactive and less proactive. It just depends on the person. Some people it will be, I really need to do something because they're not doing anything. In fact, let's see if I can help them do something. Or they're not doing anything, so there's no point in my doing something. In general, when they're talking about it, they do talk about their neighbors. But in general, when they're upset about the adjacent properties not taking responsibility. They are talking about federal land ownership nearby. And in terms of that shared responsibility, what do they expect of government agencies? They take care of their land, education, but this is not just general information, it's specific information. So risk specifics, not that there is a risk, that there is a fire, but where's the fire likely to come from? What are the conditions I need to be most worried about? How fast is it going to travel? That kind of thing. Do I need to mitigate my property differently based on where the fire is likely to come from? And that's the type of specifics on how to mitigate on their property, is very specific to what do I need to do, specific, I'm not taking that tree out because my grandmother planted it, how do I mitigate that problem? So they're looking for not general information, but very specific information for their situation and context. And maybe some help with larger scale obstacles. So what Pam was talking about with incentives for disposal is right on target. That's probably the single biggest obstacle for people, is getting rid of vegetation. In some cases, if terrain is rough or if there are a lot of elderly people, they actually need some help with actually taking out the vegetation, or if they don't have the equipment. And then finally, there's a whole bunch of demographic conventional wisdoms out there about which group of people that don't get fire, aren't doing anything, are less active. And most of these just don't hold up. So a common one is it's all the new people moving into these areas. There's no evidence that they're less active in relation to fire mitigation or aware. In fact, in many communities, they're more proactive than long-term residents. And there's two dynamics going on with this. One is across the United States, 60% of moves are actually within the county. So those people might be new to the neighborhood, they're not new to the county, and they're not new to the fire environment. Of the remaining 40%, 20% are within state moves, and only 20% are from out of state. And then the other dynamic that's going on is a thing called confirmation bias. And this is where we all do this. Once we've formed an opinion about something, we tend to give more credit to information that supports that opinion, and we tend to discount information that contradicts that opinion. And so what this says is that people who've lived in an area for a long time have kind of formed an assessment about what the fire issue is and what the right approach is and what the right management is, and they're not going to pay much attention to new information that's out there. Whereas new people know they're new, and they actually can be more receptive to information that they get out there. Part-time residents. Again, there's no evidence that they're less likely to understand the fire risks than full-time residents. And whether or not they're less proactive is very mixed. Some studies find that they do undertake less mitigation. Some studies have found they do more, and most studies find there's no big difference between part-time and full-time. When there is a distinction, the main issue seems to be about time and not knowledge. Simply, I'm only here on the weekends. I'm not going to spend it mucking around the vegetation. I'm here for a month in the summer. I don't want to deal with smoke from a prescribed fire. Now, these are part-time residents that actually do use their property. Absentee ones who fundamentally just are never, ever on their property are a different topic and are harder to reach, but there are ways around that. Experience, there's often, if we just have a fire, somebody just needs to move, who came on needs to mute. And just if they experience a fire, then, oh, they're going to get proactive, then they're going to be on board, then they're going to listen to us. And there's lots of research on natural hazards that shows that experiencing an event has an inconsistent effect. For some people, it will definitely be that moment that gets people to say, oh, okay, let's do something. For other people, it's the exact opposite. That was so big, mean, and nasty, there's no point. Or, hey, we're good. The landscape is burned. There's not going to be a fire. I don't need to worry about it. So it's not a consistent effect. It does make the issue more salient. So it goes from number 70 on the list of things I need to be thinking about to somewhere in the top 10. But over the course of months, sometimes 1 month, sometimes 6 months, it goes bumped back down to number 70 on the list of things to think about. So you do have a window, but the evidence is also clear that that window is most effective when you've been talking about this topic long before the event has happened. So it's people will say, oh, this is what they were talking about. Let me pay attention to it. And finally, there's no consistent evidence that basic demographic characteristics have a meaningful effect, that there's differences in beliefs and actions based on income or education or age. The only one where there's some indication is that women tend to have higher risk perception than men, and reflecting that if there is a homeowner who plans to stay and defend their property, they're more likely to be male. And as I said earlier, there isn't an indication that there's meaningful regional differences, but if there are differences, it's a local context thing. So it's local context, fire history, local agency-community relationships, a specific event that may have shaped how people interpret things. So it's much more a local context than a regional context that seems to inform differences. Okay, so what does shape public views? There's three key things actually. One is understanding. So the greater the knowledge of a practice, it's associated with greater support and lower concern about negative outcomes. So the more people understand the ecological benefits of prescribed fire, the lower their concerns about escape and smoke and that sort of thing, and then the higher their support for prescribed burning. So knowledge and understanding of a practice really makes a difference. Ecological benefits are particularly important. I would argue that it's more important to people than concern about fire risk. And this makes a lot of sense to me because people live out in these areas because they like nature. They want it to be in good shape. They want things to be healthy. So, and it's a positive. It's a daily exposure that they have. They'd rather look at a nice, healthy forest than one that's dead and dying. And fire, well, not exactly a positive thing to think about. It may or may never, ever affect them. So it makes sense to me that actually the knowledge about ecological benefits tends to be more influential. Now, not everybody. There will be some people for whom fire risk is more important than healthy forests. With prescribed fire, smoke definitely shapes acceptance. And the main reason is because it's a health issue for a third of households in the country. Basically, once you do the data and figure out how many people have COPD and asthma and emphysema, et cetera, roughly a third of households in the United States have someone in them who has a health issue that's going to be affected by smoke. So for these people, incredibly salient. It's going to be something that's very important to them. It can affect their, how they feel. It can make them have to go to the hospital if they're really sick. And so for these people, it's an incredibly important topic. But there is also indications that even for that group, if they can be worked with, they understand that there's sort of trade-offs of prescribed fire. At least you can maybe manage that smoke from a prescribed fire. You can also give me warning so I can get out of town and make arrangements. We won't plan on having that picnic outside. So there are ways around it, and there's some places that have developed some really great programs to do outreach to get to the people who have the health issues. And just to give you a sense for how this dynamic plays out, this is from a study we did in Blodgett Forest in California where people toured different treatments. And after the tours, we asked them to rank their treatment preference. And then we asked them to rank various factors in terms of how important it was in their decision making. And so the lower the bar, the more important it was. And unsurprisingly, forest health and reducing fire hazard come out as the most important considerations they had in terms of their treatment preferences. Then you get improving wildlife habitat, concern about erosional, concern about escape, nowhere is there smoke. Smoke was the least important variable of all the ones that were asked, lower than scenic quality, lower than recreational opportunities. Now, the manager I worked with on this looked at this and just said, your data is wrong. I don't get yelled at because of recreation stuff. I don't get yelled at because of scenic quality. I get yelled at because of smoke. Well, this is the mean. If you actually looked at the distribution of answers, it was 30% of respondents said smoke was a very important reason, and everybody else said it was not at all important or not very important. So it was a very much of a bimodal distribution of how people considered smoke in their decision making. So the good news is the majority of people smoke is not a major issue. But the other news is that a third of the population is a significant part of the population, and it is a significant impact on those people. Trust is a second dynamic that's key. Trust in government is a significant predictor of approval. In one study, it was a significant predictor of approval of thinning, prescribed fire, and defensible space in all 4 states, California, Florida, Michigan, and Missouri. And in another study, they asked a more specific question. They asked a general question about trust in the government agency and trust in agency managers to use a practice. And both of those came out as significant as a sort of individual associations, but when you actually did regression analyses to see which ones actually are predictive of what people will do. The only one that was predictive of acceptance was trust in agency managers to use a practice. So it's a specific type of trust that's around competency and ability to actually do something. And then you can see with the green circles that 80% approval comes out in this study as well. So basically, treatments will generally be acceptable if they're done by knowledgeable people, preferably locals familiar with the area, and that's part of that competency trust kind of variable. So if a practice is established, so people have had a chance to see it, to understand it, to ask questions about it, and they trust people who are implementing it, you probably have high acceptance levels. And I like to rephrase it to how I hear people actually talk about it, and they tend to talk about it as a respect issue, which is we respect the expertise of the professionals who are trained in this. We're not trying to tell them to do their job, but we don't feel the need to respect their expertise if they're not willing to respect our desire to be informed and the fact that we have concerns and our point of view is being respected. So it's kind of a mutual thing. So how does this play out in terms of the model of things? Well, this is kind of the standard one. Well, if we just get them to see the fire risk, then we're going to get them on board. And this is a model for public acceptance for thinning prescribed fire, but the dynamics are identical for defensible space, and I'll give you more details on that in a minute. So what is matter? Knowledge. Do they understand the practice, its ecological benefits, risk reduction? Concerns can also shape acceptance, but those concerns can be mitigated by knowledge. And also important to notice is that most of the concerns, escape and smoke, are routinely associated with lower acceptance levels if they have high concern about it. But a lot of the other concerns that we often raise as reasons people don't support a practice are as often as not the reason why they do support a practice. So they support prescribed burning because it improves wildlife habitat. They support prescribed burning because after 6 months, the aesthetics are actually better. So it's not a given that a concern is a negative. Trust, are the people credible? Are they competent? And the third variable is the communication process, and I'll talk more about this in a minute. But the key part of the communication process is it interactive? Can they ask questions? And is it transparent? And basically, transparency is a proxy for trust. If they don't know this person, it's a way for them to say, well, I think they're giving me the straight scoop, so I'm going to trust them. If they feel like they're not getting the straight scoop, then that's going to be a really quick decision that they are not trustworthy, so I am not going to pay attention to them. So specific to fire-wise behaviors, this is from a study in Ventura County, California, Alachua County, Florida, which is around Gainesville, and a couple counties around Helena, Montana. And so what you see is basically 80% have done at least some type of vegetation management. Much higher in Ventura County because they actually have a vegetation management ordinance there, so it makes complete sense. And these numbers of the 58, 31% are very similar to what is found in almost every single homeowner study that asks about what have you done on the property. So vegetation management is going on. In terms of the reasons, how important different reasons were why people did it, how effective it was, how much risk is there are both key factors, knowing how. But when we actually looked at which of these were actually associated with doing more, so how effective it will be was significantly associated. People who said it was very important were more likely to have indicated they had done more vegetation management. And this has been shown with a lot of mitigation activities, that the effectiveness, understanding the effectiveness is critical to people deciding that it's worth doing. But then other variables were dependent on the location. Montana was an area where they're probably doing everything themselves, so knowing how to do it, and more complex landscapes than Ventura and Alachua County. Alachua was a poor county, so cost came into play, and time as well. To what extent have you made your house more fire resistant? So overall, slightly lower numbers of people doing it. More have just done some as opposed to a great deal. This makes sense to me because we actually have not emphasized making our house more fire resistant until I'd say maybe the past 5 or 6 years. But it's also useful to notice that we asked them sort of when did this happen? For a number of these, they existed when purchased. So it's also possible people said, I didn't do much because they actually literally had not done much. It was just there. Then the other thing to notice is that it's pretty equal as to why they've done it. The main reason they may have done it for fire or they may have not. And that's a key thing to think about is people often have really good defensible space elements and they have them for reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with fire. And that's something that we can use to our advantage. The other thing to notice here is that there is a significant number of items that people do not plan to do. And I think these are items where we have not done a great job of showing how they're effective. So I can see how people say, well, I don't understand what difference boxing my eaves is going to make. I don't understand how enclosing my desk is going to make. So if they don't understand why it makes a difference, there's a good reason why they probably won't plan to do it. And this is just from another site in Wisconsin where we asked more specific what were the main reasons you took this, so they could answer more than one question. But the key point is to see that aesthetics actually comes out as more important than fire risk for many of these vegetation management issues. Wind damage, they had blowdowns in Wisconsin, so wind damage was actually a key reason for removing overhanging branches. And it's really only with firewood piles that slightly more for fire risk and changing your roof and building construction. But the point, again, is that there's a lot of reasons why people will have what we want them to have, and we need to use all those reasons, not just fire. So again, we asked them how important, and what's key to just notice simply that cost and knowing how switch places. So cost becomes more important, which makes sense. And then time and rules and programs switch places. And that makes sense because there's actually fewer rules and programs in places. But what's interesting to notice is when you look at where were there significant relationships, they're not as consistent. They're not as consistent about how effective it will be. And again, I would suspect that's because we don't do a good job of explaining how these building changes make their property more fire safe. But variables change. So Ventura and Alachua County were more urban areas, and they're more likely, in my view, to hire a contractor to implement these changes, so cost becomes more important for them. Montana was very rural areas where people were likely to be doing that themselves, so knowing how and having the physical ability to do it is going to be more important for those groups. And so in another study, we asked, what are your motivations for wildfire mitigation? And so this is just sort of to show that there's a range of reasons, but I think the key is common sense and risk awareness are kind of the dominant ones. When you ask people where do we get the risk, and they just say, look around you. Of course there's fire risk. Aesthetics, and the other point here is to show that what motivation varies by community. So agency outreach was really important in 2 of the communities. Homeowners Association was really important in a couple of communities. And a non-neighborhood program was a program in Idaho where they actually just trained contractors who went door to door and said, hi, do you want defensible space? We'll give it to you for free. And the thinking there was it was a very poor area where the people didn't really have the resources. It was very thickety dogwood, lodgepole pine. And they needed to create jobs. So they created jobs with the contractors. The contractors went to the homeowners. And we interviewed the homeowners, and they basically said, yeah, this was great. And I was always going to do it, but this helped us overcome the first big hump because we didn't have the equipment to take out the trees, but now I can just keep going. And we actually went back 3 years later, and they had maintained their property, and they'd actually begun to do a bit more in some places. And I'm just going to skip that to save time. That was just some of the fewer other items that influence people. And then what helped them to decide to do? Again, the point here is just to say that what is important is going to vary by community. So forest agency, state, federal. In Utah A, the forest agency was state, and they actually had a very active program, matching program, where they would match hours and provide service crews who would come in and help to do defensible space. So, which was really important because they had very steep terrain. Homeowners Association, Oregon B, just simply had one woman who ran the Homeowners Association who was like hell-bent on making sure everybody had defensible space. So each community had different things that were really influential in what made people work. And the point of this one is from us just to say that there is a sense that regulation is acceptable, but in specific situations, and this basically tends to be places, more urban areas, where houses are close enough together that what my neighbor does affects my risk, and where there is an actual government, city government, that has a public safety role. And then if you have those two factors and high fire risk, then people basically feel that mandatory regulation is justified. But if you don't have those pieces in place, then you're probably going to have a harder time with actually mandatory versus voluntary regulation. So kind of the final takeaways are people are taking action. Is it enough? Is it the right action? I do think defensible space is 50% science and 50% art. I have certainly looked at houses with a couple firefighters, and one has said, that house is good, and another said, you're kidding me, it's terrible. So, I don't think it's that clear cut as to if people are doing the right stuff. Other factors I haven't mentioned, I did mention vegetation disposal. Often there's competing and complementary values. I know in Incline Village, they have issues with making sure there's enough pine needles on the ground to prevent erosion versus taking pine needles off to make sure that you don't have a fire value, and they've had to negotiate what the appropriate level is. Social norms can work both ways. You can have a community where the norm is, no, we don't want to see each other, we should have enough vegetation to not see each other, or you can have one where the norm is actually, no, our risk all affects each other, we're all going to work together to reduce our risk. So how does this play out when we think about defensible space? Again, this is sort of the standard model that if we give them information about risk, then they're going to act. So it's sort of what we call a knowledge deficit model. But it really isn't a knowledge deficit. It's a much more complicated dynamic. So information is important. They do need to understand what are the possible mitigation measures I can take. It'll also be influenced by their perceptions of the fire risk, their risk tolerance, their experience, the social norms. Did they get information from a source they trust? Was it interactive? Could they ask questions? So all of those pieces might come together to the point where they're going to consider taking action. But consider taking action does not necessarily lead to action. What happens is people then go into a trade-off analysis. So, okay, maybe I should do something. Well, let me look at this. Is it going to be effective? Okay, I think it's probably effective. Do I have the time, the money, the ability to do it? Can I get rid of the vegetation? Are there other values that are complementary? So, oh, I will get, this will also protect me from wind damage. A metal roof will protect me from, it's better for snow. It looks nicer. Or competing values. What's going on my adjacent property? What are the social norms? And if all of those come out to be a positive, then they're going to act. And if all those come out to be a not so sure, then they probably won't act. So I think the challenge with outreach programs is to figure out where are your points of leverage to shift that trade-off analysis towards action. And I think that's going to vary by the community, and that's going to vary by the individual. So basic outreach considerations. To think about, there's a lot of science actually on how to get people to do things. One is called diffusion of innovations, and this has basically been around since the 1930s, and it's looking at adoption of new technologies. And so basically some of the things that they've identified that drive how fast a new technology or new practice, a new method diffuse are the attributes of the innovation. So what do I think about it? Is it going to be effective? How does it, is it aesthetically pleasing? All the things that I've been talking about. What do others think about it? So those social norms and getting your neighbor coming to you and saying, hey, I think this is a great idea. Informal opinion leaders can be critical in a community. Who do people go to say, what do you think? And then finally, the timing and the framing of the introduction. So how do you frame it, not just about fire risk, about ecology or whatever the community actually cares about? And I think this is the classic model of diffusion. And a lot of times people get frustrated because it seems to be taking so long, but that's actually very normal. So you traditionally have early adopters. Those are the people who wait in line for the next iPhone. And then somebody sees somebody using the newest iPhone and says, ooh, I kind of like that, and they'll adopt it. And then you keep going up and people start saying, well, everybody has one. Maybe I need to have one to operate similarly. And it goes like that. And you'll have a steeper curve in the middle, and then it's going to level off as you get people who just start saying, no, I don't really need an iPhone. I'm quite happy with my flip phone. And you will inevitably get some people who never, ever adopt. And then there's a whole bunch of things from social marketing, environmental ed. Social marketing is how do we get people to not drive drunk, to wear a seatbelt, to stop smoking, et cetera. And the key points from that, I'm just going to highlight. It's very important to understand your audience, and that's a lot of what I've been talking about before this, is to help sort of say, here's actually what people think, here's what they respond to, here's what shapes their decisions, to sort of avoid those preconceived notions. If you walk in thinking they don't understand the risk and they do understand the risk, then they're going to, you're telling them what they already know about, and they're going to say, well, I don't need to listen to this. And if you can figure out what they care about, then you can leverage that. And you can also identify the resource limitations. Maybe, as I've said, it's not a knowledge issue, it's just simply a time issue. So this is sort of the standard communication behavior we tend to think of. If we provide people with information, that's going to change behavior. That's not how the world works. Providing information does increase awareness. Increased awareness does not lead to behavior change. So how do we get behavior change? Mass media, we tend to like that. It's fast. It covers a lot of people. It's cheap. It can be very good for raising awareness levels, not that great for changing behavior. It can change behavior if you have a very simple thing you're asking people to do. But even something as simple as telling people to, put their seatbelt on takes a long time to get people to do. The more complex the behavior change, the less effective it's going to be. Brochures are a critical part of it, however, because once people have decided, maybe I should do something, brochures have the level of detail that can give them the information that they need to start making that decision. What is critical for behavior change is talking to people. It's that interactive communication. It fosters changes in behavior and norms. It lets people ask questions. It allows clarification going both directions. And it builds trust. People understand where the other person's coming from and what they're trying to achieve and that sort of thing. Use all the good reasons. One reason to change a behavior or a norm is not better than others. Different people care about different things, so we might really be worried about the risk mitigation, but other people might care a lot more about recreational opportunities or wildlife and that sort of thing. So use all the good reasons. Use all the outlets. Do find outlets that people can trust. So use partnerships. Figure out what's appropriate to the audience you're trying to reach. These are all things that I'm sure you guys already know. This is just another demonstration of how information sources that people learn about fire risk vary by community, by individual, but personal experience and common sense were the two most commonly mentioned topics when we asked people in these communities. Homeowners association important in some places, not in others. Agency personnel important in some places, not in others, et cetera. Local fire activity, one community, it was really important. The rest, even though two of the other communities also had fire exposure, not as important. Delivery approach all the time, information stream, diverse methods. There is no magic method other than talking to people is probably a magic method, but use them all. Different people use different things. And so finally, I'm just going to quickly go over a more recent synthesis that was done, and basically, because it has more research on outreach programs, but basically it reinforces everything I've already talked to you about what's important in terms of dynamics. It also highlights that these dynamics are important not just before a fire, but they're important during a fire and they're important after a fire. So we tend to date, focus on the before fire part, but these dynamics are just as important at all the other points in time. There is a growing body of research on outreach programs, and they do really show that they can build community capacity, they can strengthen social networks, and increase information sharing and mitigation. They do need to take local and cultural context into account. They're going to be more successful, and as I'm sure you have all figured out, no single program is effective. Local context really matters. Place attachment is really important, and whether or not it is taken into account in the outreach in general will shape views of fire management. So particularly during a fire, if local knowledge is not used during a fire, that can really affect how people think it was managed. It can affect the interactions with an agency, and it really does affect how people interpret and act on information. So if it's not seen as locally relevant and taking local context into account, it's less likely to be seen as trustworthy and relevant to the individual. So outreach programs that do this are more likely to be successful. They're better able to access interpersonal networks and to engage part-time residents because they can figure out where those interpersonal networks are and what their part-time residents, when they're in town, et cetera, and to identify what are the really specific local barriers that are the problem and how do we target it. So that program in Idaho, big problem was people who just didn't have a lot of money, didn't have a lot of resources, and so they went in and helped them get over that big hump. And social interactions and networks are key. That has come out very strongly in this last crop of research in the last five years. They really do facilitate learning and building community capacity, and that's why this learning network is a great example of that. There was one study from Australia that I thought did a very nice job of explaining the process. They basically said that sort of outreach helped build social networks that led to the development of shared goals and a sense of community, and that those shared goals and sense of community then led to a sense of shared responsibility and a desire to do something. I need to do it for myself, but also for others. And so they concluded that facilitating social network development was the most efficient way for agencies to encourage preparedness. So they sort of said, it's not about giving information to people. That's not the most efficient way. It's facilitating that social network development that can facilitate information exchange and build this sense of community. Now, it is not a given that those networks or interactions need to be focused. That can work really well in a neighborhood, on a street, but they can also be much more diffuse. You know, there's a lot of rural areas where people aren't necessarily living near each other and are out there not to talk to each other all the time. But social networks can still make a difference in those groups. They're just going to look slightly different. Financial support is important. I know you guys know that one, so I'm not even going to touch on it. So basically, to summarize, it's important to continually assess your notion of imagined public with empirical reality. What do data actually tell us? And a good way to sort of do that is to listen and ask questions of people and figure out what the local context, account for that, increases success rates, and interactions and social networks really do help change behavior. So there we go. That's where you can get more details on a lot of what I've talked about. Those are the numbers and the GTR location. So I went through very fast, given time, and I don't know if we have time for questions or anything like that.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That is a fantastic wealth of knowledge. Really appreciate it. We have about 10 minutes for question and discussion. I saw a couple of remarks in the discussion in the chat box that I would bring back, but I'd just open it up to people to reflect on how this relates to your work, your experience, or ask any specific questions to Sarah at this point. You can raise your hand or you could just unmute yourself and chime in. So Jonathan, I'd love to hear more about the chat post that you put up there. It came in a little late and maybe a little out of context, but you were talking about how something triggers within the area to build that sector.
Can you guys, go ahead. Can you hear me? Okay, so really what I think and what we've seen in the rural part of our watershed where we work is that indeed we do run into some issues with the local contractor or forestry sector base. In some areas we might have one or two contractors, and if we're talking about trying to achieve really large projects or maybe even 100 acres, it might exceed their capacity. And so one of the things that we've been doing, and of course it's sort of the cart before the horse. You need to have your funding in place to be able to have forest projects, to be able to hire forest contractors, but we've always viewed this as a very symbiotic relationship with our partners and with the contractors, in that if we don't have a contractor sector, we're not seeing success on the ground. And part of the stuff that we've really worked on is building that base. And so whether that's leading, S212 equivalency chainsaw classes or hosting, we have a program that we call Chainsaws and Paper Towels, where we do a full housekeeping and we help new contractors get registered with the state and introduce them to what type of insurance they would need to be effective and help them with their bidding process. But that's just as important as, those residents on board. We can't really achieve acres if we don't have that contractor base. So that's kind of what I was talking about is the need for all of us as we're doing this work to really facilitate that process and to allow people to exceed as forestry contractors in the area. We've run into some major challenges. I've had some guys that we realized very quickly that weren't really cut out for it, and we've seen them go away, and that's not at all what that's not a success. That's not what we want to see happen. And so after some of those situations occurred, we realized very quickly that we needed to help them succeed.
Yeah, thanks, and that speaks to that issue of local capacity and local institutions like your own being in service both to the landowners and to that infrastructure that assists them, that technical assistance and labor assistance. Becca, do you want to share your chat posts verbally?
You'll need to unmute. I muted a lot of people, and I can't tell which lines are which.
Well, while she's unmuting, I will just comment that Pam Wilson's comment about 10 to 15% of their chipper rebates go to part-time and out-of-town residents, which is really interesting. Good to hear, and a nice measure to have.
Yeah, really interesting given that 50% of those residences are actually out-of-towners. So starts to give a sense beyond the kind of the method of self-reporting.
And I think the interesting thing to think about with out-of-towners is that they have that place for a reason, and the place attachment is just important to them and maybe more important in some ways. So if you can get to that, then they care about their property. And I just go to that point from the study we did of health impacts after the wildfire, where we found no difference between part-time and full-time residents in terms of how it impacted them. It was just as important to them that the landscape had burned. So I think that is one reason why part-timers are not inherently less likely to do something.
Another thing that I was struck by that's sort of this emerging, best practice across, certainly within the network and across the broader field of practices, having these local, diverse kind of local coordinating groups that are planning and sort of sharing in the responsibility of outreach and education coming from a lot of different sectors. And that seems like a really effective way to start to build that social network that can reach all of the different sectors of the community with the right sort of messengers. I don't know if you've sort of come across any research on that as a specific strategy or have any thoughts on that, thinking about fire safe councils or local wildfire coalitions, and
Oh, I'm sorry, Nick. I was reading the chat box. What were you saying?
I was just reflecting on the sort of local, fire safe councils or coalitions and the diversity of participants in those as this sort of foundation to creating that social network and reaching different people with different, the right messenger.
Yeah, no, and one of the things that also came out in sort of the more recent work is that, sort of I talk about the social networks, and it's part of that is connecting homeowner with homeowner, but one of the other conclusions is that ones that connect communities to fire agency members is also critical, and having a middle intermediate program like fire safe councils and that sort of thing often has a really important function in doing that.
Did you see anything else in the chat that was of interest to address, Sarah? Folks have any other questions? We have time for another question.
I think one of the comments I would make is I do know that sort of saying interactive communication can be overwhelming, but the good news of that is it's not just interactive communication with you. So when I hear people say, oh, we were so disappointed only 10 people showed up at our meeting, well, those 10 people may be going out and talking to all their neighbors. So you may actually have had 40 people at the meeting. So it's not just on you.
Excellent. One of the other things that came to mind for me in listening to your talk and thinking about the community of practice around, engagement that Justice was speaking to earlier is this, all of this synthesis and information about the audiences we're trying to reach, is super relevant to developing a communications and outreach and engagement strategy. And it'd be interesting to think about how we package that into, local assessments that help to create those communications plans and strategies and sort of bring this, both this sort of synthesis information and then ways for people to evaluate their own local context into then developing a plan.
Yeah, and I will say the one thing, again, there's so much information, you leave stuff out, but in terms of trusted information sources, the local fire department is almost always the top most trusted information source. Federal agencies actually come out quite well in relation to fire. State agencies, it really depends on the state. Some places they're very trusted, and some places they're not trusted at all. So those are a couple sources, and then others, organizations and stuff are also trusted. But the local fire department is almost always the most trusted.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sarah, for sharing all you've learned. Really, really appreciate it. Thanks